Uh, as I said, I'm a religious studies professor, so I always appreciate the religion and genocide content. And this is an excellent panel. And Kate Temoney's been here, I think, almost every year. Kyle and I met in 2017 at the Holocaust Museum, went to a Washington Nationals game together. When he showed up last night to Jason Stanley's talk, it was like, the Toronto Blue Jays are in town this weekend. I wish I could stay for a game. It's we're both Canadian and baseball fans, and we repped the Blue Jays hat this morning.
You bet.
And however, just to tie it all together, as I pass this off to Jason Bruner, my esteemed colleague in religious studies, Jason and I are in fact going to a Blue Jays Diamondback game this morning or this weekend. So we're going to make Kyle jealous. We'll just have that memory of the Nationals game, Kyle.
Yeah, that's all we got.
Don't have the Jays games. Jason will do that
vicariously.
Without further ado, Jason, I will hand this off to you to introduce our speakers, and thank you for doing this. And please note the fashion.
Well, that was a sideways introduction. I am going to a baseball game. All right. So for those of you who might be joining for the first time, welcome. And it's my privilege to sort of introduce this panel on religion, authoritarianism, and genocide. It's so nice to see so many faces here, and that's the result of a number of staff, some of whom you see in the room in the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies and Jewish Studies, Tim and the board of GAW. So please thank them for putting this together for you. So to my left is Kate Temoney, who's an associate professor and chair of the Department of Religion and special advisor to the Provost on Interdisciplinary Initiatives at Montclair State University. She's a member of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's Committee on Religion and the Holocaust, and an editor for Genocide Studies and Prevention, an international journal. Her scholarship examines the intersections of religion, human rights, genocide, and theory of history. And then next to Kate is Kyle Jantzen, who's Dean of Arts and Science at Ambrose University in Calgary, Canada. He's professor of history, specializing in the relationship between church and state in Nazi Germany. His research extends to Christian responses to the Holocaust and the wider subject of religion and nationalism. So please welcome Kate. I believe you'll be going first, and thank you very much.
And you could also never thank your organizers enough. So thank you to all of our organizers. And especially to Tim, who has graciously invited me for several years in a row now. So my name is Kate Temoney, and I have my Canadian to my left. Canadian. I'm going to be honoring Doris Bergen at a symposium that's in Toronto. Stanley last night defected to Canada. So when the revolution goes down, remember your friend. So I'm wearing all black today, not because I'm mourning the topic, but because it's a slimming color. So, yeah. So let's go ahead and get started. So my talk today is very plainly titled Religion, Authoritarianism, and Genocide. I decided to just go straight for it. And what I'm going to be doing in these next 15 minutes is trying to give you a sense of how these three things might work together. So I'm not going to get into this really deep philosophical argument, and it's mostly because we do have a lot of students who are here. I tried to prepare this as a kind of mini lecture / orientation to some of my scholarship kind of presentation. And so that's what we'll be doing. I was a religion and psychology double major. Anybody in here also a double major? Okay, so good call. So I started out as a psych major, and then I decided to pick up religion. I actually was on track to go to medical school, so you'll see that there, is a medical term in here from reliving those glory days. And what I'm trying to do this afternoon is put together for you some of that reminiscent. You're so welcome. I'm trying to kind of reminisce a bit in starting with my roots. So I'm going to start with a little psychology, and then I'm going to end with where we are now, which is looking at some of my recent publications and how that ties in to a trajectory of my work. So at some point, every scholar in their lives at some point says, what have I done? It's been over a decade now. You re-examine, you rethink, you revisit. And so I'm taking this opportunity as a vanity moment to look at where I started as an undergrad, as a religion and psych major, and pulling on some of that to now where I stand before you today. So what I want to be looking at is authoritarian religion. And this is actually inspired by Doris Bergen, who has this concept of Nazi Christian and Christian Nazis, right? And she tries to make this distinction, although the terms look very similar. So she talks about Nazi Christians, who are those who are lay people, those who are clergy, but who embrace Nazi ideology. And then she looks at those who are Christian Nazis, those who are Nazis, part of the National Socialist Party, but who still saw themselves as being very devout Christians, right? So that kind of concept, this idea of these two terms that look very similar but reversed, kind of inspired me to talk about this concept of authoritarian religion versus religious authoritarianism. I'm then going to move on to how we might triangulate this. So I'm a genocide scholar, and of course we are at Genocide Awareness Week. So in talking about these two matters, I would also like to talk a little bit about genocide toward the end and how we might see it pulling things together. And I'm actually using two pieces I've published in the last couple of years to kind of anchor that conversation and as an illustration. So I have committed the cardinal sin of having a lot of text. So I decided, however, that was a lesser sin, a venial, not a mortal sin, because I'd much rather you follow along than just keep going and you're like, oh, what's going on? So that's what I decided to do. Plus, let's be real, it's after lunch. So I'm going to try to be relatively short. I'm going to try to be relatively funny. So authoritarianism. So going back to, again, my psychology, my roots, there's this really, really, really famous study that was published in 1967. And it was looking at religiosity and prejudice. And as you can see here, it was determined that there are these different types of religiosity, those that are intrinsic orientations and those that have an extrinsic orientation to their religiosity. And it turned out that those who had this rather intrinsic orientation, where they were seeking ultimate meaning as a means to kind of achieve their goals, as kind of like a worldview, that they tended to actually be less prejudiced, versus those who had a more extrinsic orientation, social status, comfort, security, who instrumentalized their religion. They tended to be more prejudiced. So one of the things, and there's all sorts of questions and concerns and problems with this study, but it's interesting. And it's an interesting place to start, because one thing that I would like to propose is that those two things actually aren't separate. They actually, I think, go together. And then we'll see when I talk about white nationalism and this concept of white genocide, part of my argument is I think that is those two things dovetailing each other. And that's part of why it's so powerful. Another even longer slide, even greater sin, is this gentleman, Eric Fromm. So 67, again, that was a good year, 67. And he actually talks about a concept of authoritarian religion specifically, and contrasts that to humanitarian religion. And so as you can see here, I'm not going to read it to you, but basically it talks about power, powerful authority. It's kind of obedience to that powerful authority. And that the act of surrender, this is very sexist, right? It should be they or anyone loses their independence and integrity as an individual, but gains the feeling of being protected by an awe-inspiring power, which, as it were, that becomes a part, right? So this idea of authoritarian religion demands strict obedience. And also, if you're in the out group, if you somehow fall out of line, it tends to be very hard lines, very strict, very disciplined, right? So this idea of authoritarian religion, we always had a concept of it, even in the 60s. So again, so that harkens back to some of my kind of religious roots. Another way in which I like to think about authoritarian religion is now journeying to some very lovely people that I began to meet along the way in becoming a genocide scholar. So it's not terribly common for someone to be, in my case, I'm a religious ethicist. So it's not very common for someone who's trained in religion specifically to be a genocide scholar. Typically, it's somebody who's a historian or an international lawyer or maybe a sociologist or a psychologist, but not a lot of folks who are trained as religious ethicists or in religion who are also genocide scholars. And so this has been a really enduring interest of mine. But as I went through my career, of course, I started interacting with a lot of historians. And so, of course, I was exposed to the concept of fundamentalism as just a religion scholar. But in thinking about it in genocide studies, we have someone like Karen Armstrong, who's pretty well known. And so this idea of fundamentalism that she visits, and this is in 2000, in a book that she publishes, she wants to talk about fundamentalism not as this kind of like 19th century, 20th century concept that we see specific to Christianity or to Protestantism, but as you can see here, this kind of more wide-ranging kind of pattern that we can see in several different types of religion, not just relegated to Christianity. And toward the end here, it reads that they are engaged in a conflict with enemies, and I keep stepping out, and I know you keep asking me not to do that.
I zoomed back. You can be.
Okay, I can do this. So they are engaged in a conflict with enemies whose secularist policies and beliefs seem inimical to religious self. Fundamentalists do not regard this battle as a conventional political struggle, but experience it as a cosmic war. This is Juergensmeyer. This is something he often uses, between the forces of good and evil, right? So as you can see, I'm journeying through my career as a genocide scholar, and I'm starting to think more about all these concepts and how they're coming together. So I think this is very useful in thinking about how we might think about authoritarianism and religion. And the reason why is because there have been some people who posited that specifically exclusivist religions, like monotheistic traditions, tend, because of that exclusionary kind of belief system, somehow tend more toward violence. I actually wouldn't agree with that. And so I think the bigger issue is not exclusionary monotheism. I think it's actually fundamentalism, right? It's not really anything about Christianity or specific, I think, to exclusionary beliefs in one particular God. So that's one of the reasons why I want to talk about fundamentalism, because I think that is part of how we might understand these kind of authoritarian religions. So in looking at religion, of course, we have to look at religion and the state, right? So authoritarianism, we're talking about leaders, we're talking about types of governance that are totalitarian. And so as a kind of drill, I'm going to go out and then kind of drill back in, is what are some resources? And again, I knew I was talking to a lot of you today who are undergraduate students, and I'm all about giving you things that you can take back and look up later, things you can reference later in something that you're writing. And so I want to give you a couple of things. And so one of them is, I have two reports here side by side. These ran for, as you can see here, for a little, about 13 years or so. It was over a long period of time. This one here is from the Pew Research Center. And then the one on the right is actually a UN report from the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief. And both of them are looking at this relationship between religion and the state. And so as you can see here on the left, it indicates that 4 in 10 countries have official state religions or kind of preferred religions. And you can see in the gray, those are no official or preferred. In the kind of light blues, preferred, and then the darker blues, there's an official state religion. And then as we can see here in the orange, there is an active kind of hostility toward religion. Some might argue that maybe the US shouldn't be in the gray. Maybe we're what? The light blue? Yeah, maybe the light blue. And then, so let me update this a bit. And then we see next to it is the rapporteur report. And as you can see here, the number of member states is listed, and then the number of communications. And so, and roughly it maps on, not quite, but it roughly maps on to the prior one. Now, interesting here where it reads number of communications. That sounds innocuous. It's like, oh yeah, they communicated. That's lovely. They slipped into my DMs. That's great. No, that's not what that is. So communications are we have credible information or evidence that you're engaging in human rights violations and abuses. And we're notifying you of this fact. So those numbers there are not good, right? So 412. So states with official or favored religions have a much higher, almost double, right? Or a little actually over double the rate of those who have a negative view actually toward religion. Right. So again, so I'm trying to kind of set up this relationship between the religion, between religion and the state. And the reason why this is important is because we're going to see that that relationship can go lots of different ways. And the way in which they go can even be different in their authoritative kind of relationship. So what are kind of the relationships between religion and the state? And then specifically, what is a relationship between maybe an authoritative regime and the state? What are the different variations of that? So that's kind of where we are here. So let's look at my time. Okay. Is that right? I have 3 minutes left. That's amazing. Okay. So, so let's wrap this up, shall we? So the last couple of things that I'll say are that this is my term. So and look at, that's why it was misspelled, because there are 2 R's. It's religious authoritarianism. That's my term. I'm coining that. That's not a spelling error. So here I'm looking at Kazel and Sarkisson, I think, have a really great idea of how they might kind of map out this relationship. And it's called a toolkit, an authoritarian toolkit, believe it or not, and how they are going to interact with established religious traditions. So one is through patronage, one is through legal and policy concessions, another one is through specific political parties that have an affiliation, and one is through bureaucracies. And so all of these have various levels of protections, various levels of exchange by which both the religious institutions and members enjoy some kind of privilege or freedom or special kind of treatment in exchange to that authoritarian regime, which usually requires some kind of absolute loyalty and a public declaration of that absolute loyalty. So I'm calling this symbiosis, right? This is a biological term about organisms that are able to then have some kind of relationship, and they can vary. It can be parasitic, right? But in this case, I'm talking about kind of mutual symbiosis, which is whereby both the parties get something out of it. So I think that's great. I also think that Ruth Van Giat, when she talks about this idea of authoritarian bargaining, right? This bargain, I think it's the same kind of concept. Speaking of Giat, she also, I think, has an interesting way of thinking about religious authoritarianism, which is a kind of like sacralization. And again, this is kind of my term, like, so symbiosis and sacralization. Anybody who knows me knows I love my alliteration. So this is my foray into that. And here she references the fact that there's some kind of divine instrument that leader is being deemed as. And this allows them to be able to do all sorts of things because, God works in mysterious ways and uses vessels that, are the most unassuming. So it really kind of shrouds this person with a kind of authority that allows them to do things that otherwise would not be considered, copacetic. And then it's also kind of legitimation, right? There are certain acts that they're going to engage in. Authoritarians often don't have popular support, right? So they actually need some kind of legitimation through another group in order to shore up some of that support, usually of a much smaller group. So let's see. So let me wrap this up. By just looking at 2 pieces and connecting this to genocide. And I'll just be really, really brief here. So one quick update is that when I wrote this piece, which is my race, which is on kind of my race is my religion. So this is a piece that I wrote that was looking at Christian nationalists and their claims of white genocide. Like, where does that come from? Why does it seem to have such staying power? How are they able to effectively get out their message? And so in that piece, I broke down how I think their message tries to paper over the differences amongst a lot of Christian groups and unite them around their race. And that they see this as an embattled group, that there's like a siege being laid upon them by the larger community. I put it 15 minutes and it said I had 3 minutes left. Okay. Okay. Wow, more Kate. All right. So it indicates that there is this from what I could tell, it seems as though there's some factions within these Christian communities. Some of them are actually religious, some of them aren't, some of them are Christian, some of them aren't. But they're saying, but look, we're besieged. We need to get together. There needs to be some solidarity. And we can actually, that solidarity can be around our whiteness. And that is going to be our central point of orientation. Remember going back to earlier, intrinsic, extrinsic, this idea of my point of orientation and meaning? It's whiteness in this particular instance. And then the kind of extrinsic benefit, right, the security that comes from that is that we need to group together in order to try to stave off the fact that we are dwindling in number. And there's a nefarious kind of intent there. It's not just the fact that people are just having more babies who are a different group. No, there's something nefarious about that. And so what I see here, down here at the bottom, is I just gave you like a quick little update, which is in 2000, I believe it's 23, there's a report that came out from the Public Religion Research Institute, and it indicates that, if you can read this, it indicates that nearly 2/3 of white evangelical Protestants in the United States qualify as either Christian national adherents, about 29%, or sympathizers, 35%. Right. So this is me kind of bringing together how I wrote this piece on Christian nationalism, and the fact that they greatly overlap with white evangelical Christians, and in talking about this kind of Protestant white evangelicalism as a kind of authoritarian religion, right? The fundamental part of being this white evangelical actually quite dovetails, overlaps with Christian nationalism, right? So this is me kind of trying to bring all that together. And so that's the unification idea, is that we all need to band together. The other one is standardization. And I think this is partly where the sympathizer part comes from, which is, I'm going to give you these talking points. They're white nationalist talking points. I don't tell you they're white nationalist talking points, but they sound reasonable. And you start agreeing with me, not knowing that is a white nationalist talking point. So, why can't communities just have countries for themselves? Africans have Africa. Like, why can't we have a country, right? Or don't you want security for, don't you want to be able to preserve your cultural identity? Right? There are things that sound reasonable. And so there's this kind of standardization by which language that otherwise would be polarizing somehow becomes mainstream and more acceptable. And then last, there's a kind of mobilization of this community. And for a lot of people, this can be a violent kind of mobilization. Mm-hmm. So because we are under attack, we need to somehow take measures to protect ourselves. Right. So in trying to figure out this relationship between authoritarianism and between religion and looking how it might intersect with genocide, I chose to look at this idea of white genocide and how we can see this kind of fundamentalism within evangelicalism that overlaps with Christian nationalism as a way of thinking about a relationship amongst the three. The other quick relationship that I'll refer to is a piece that I also wrote, and this is the more recent of the two. So again, this is bringing it full circle, right? So we started with undergrad, Gesundheit. Undergrad, right? Crying my eyes out, freshman year, right? To now. This is the last piece that I refer to. So I was also looking at Rwanda. And so we don't often talk about Rwanda and religion and genocide and authoritarianism post-conflict. It's easy to talk about religion, genocide, and authoritarianism when it comes to perpetration. Both of those involve human rights violations, right? So there are lots of connections there. But I want to talk about it in the sense of, well, here we are now post-genocide, and how are these three things coming together? And so what I kind of see happening in the Kagame regime, President Kagame in Rwanda, is both a discrediting of religion and an embracing of religion as a way of trying to shore up his authority. And in this sense, he's trying to do it in order to have a Rwandan identity that doesn't break down into specific ethnicities as a way of trying to stave off violence. It's also a way of becoming a kind of international darling, getting international aid, becoming more technologically advanced, right? There's all sorts of things that also go into this. But the last two things that I'll share is I think he discredits religion by always emphasizing the destructive role that the Catholic Church played, specifically those parishioners who lure people, for instance, into their sanctuaries. You know, some of the full-throated rhetoric that came from those who were part of religious tradition. So he always reminds people of that and how it's kind of introduced by these colonizers. Right? So there's that kind of constant reminder. And then he also closed quite a few churches and mosques. And part of this, and this goes back to a point that I think is also well made by one of our previous scholars, which is one of the reasons why religion and authoritarianism, why sometimes they go together, sometimes they come apart. But in the ways that they kind of come apart is that we have what we call kind of competing centers of authority, right, between like a government and religion. And so this is one of the reasons, like, say, China, right, highly regulates its 5 official religions because it's seen as potentially a rival. We're competing for your loyalty, right? Is it loyalty to the state or is it loyalty to this transcendent kind of doctrine or community, right? So they're competing in that way. Yeah. And so, and then also, second, if you think about it, about collections of people who have great impact, who have resources, who have transnational identities, government, religious institutions. And so those grassroots communities can come together and they can be pretty powerful in resisting any kind of authoritarian rule. And so sometimes they're antagonistic to each other. But as we can see here, I think Kagame recognized that. He recognizes, okay, these churches, these mosques that are popping up, there are conversations or things that are happening beyond my control. I want to make sure I'm infiltrating those spaces. I'm highly regulating them. You have to get, certification to become a minister. I'm going to shut this down supposedly because it's unsafe, right? There are people who are swindling people out of them, all sorts of excuses to close them down because they're competing with them. But then but he also, I think, because there is a history of religiosity amongst Rwandans and not just export religions, but amongst their own Kinyarwanda tradition, he can't just completely ignore it. And no authoritarian can afford to do that, to just completely ignore religion. They have to manage it. They have to deal with it somehow. And so here he emphasizes things like godly leadership values, or subtly makes comments, makes references to the dynasty of a golden age in Rwandan rulership, which kind of posits him as what they call the new Moame, right? Or the person who is the kind of divine king that's elected from the line of people in which he kind of claims heritage. So you can often see how there's this push and pull between how religion is used in authoritarian regimes, but at the same time that there are religious communities and institutions that can greatly benefit from aligning themselves with these authoritarian regimes. I think that's closer to maybe 50 or 20 minutes. Okay.
Good afternoon. It is lovely to be here. I have not been down this part of the world for quite a while, and it's neat who you run into. Great to be with Kate again after meeting a month ago in Washington at the committee meetings, and grateful for Tim for the introduction and getting to connect again after about a decade. And then I sat down and ended up beside Dirk Moses, who I first met in 1999 when we were part of the same Holocaust Educational Foundation. Yeah, that's right. It was a story that you maybe don't look at, but I look at. Anyway, I'm grateful to follow Kate because what she is, the sort of theoretical she has laid down, I'm going to take you into the weeds on some very specific historical stuff and see if we can make some sense out of religion, authoritarianism, and genocide. Who stands firm? Where are the responsible ones? Are we still of any use? These are 3 questions the 36-year-old German theologian and pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote in an essay entitled After 10 Years, an account at the turn of the year 1942-43. He wrote this to close friends and family members. It was an essay in which he assessed the effects of a decade of life under authoritarian rule and the effect of a decade of life living with people we would today call Christian nationalists. It is his reflection about how German political and church cultures had disintegrated so completely and how even the most noble people were implicated in this moral collapse. I want to think together with you today about two ideas. I want to think about the reciprocal nature of the relationship between religion and authoritarianism. And then second, I want to think about the fraught relationship between opposition and complicity in the exclusion and violence of authoritarian regimes. So first off, religion and authoritarianism. Now, Kate and other scholars like Doris Bergen have done lots of good theoretical work around the relationships between religion and genocide, and especially Christianity and genocide. Whether it's through theological warrants and frameworks that help justify genocide, or religion as a motivating or legitimating force for extreme violence. I'm curious about how these mechanisms work and want to suggest that we think together about how religious groups and their leaders are drawn into and benefit from authoritarian regimes, and then how in reciprocal fashion they provide powerful legitimation for authoritarian political movements and leaders. So how are religious groups and leaders drawn in? How do they benefit? And how do they legitimate authoritarian politics? I have read nothing that I think explains the politicization and mobilization and manipulation of Christianity by far-right politics in our own time or in the 1930s and 40s better than Dietrich Bonhoeffer's After 10 Years, and especially a section called On Stupidity. Now, I will read you a good bit of this section, but I want you to know that he is not referring to stupidity in a cognitive sense. He is referring to a kind of moral or ethical stupidity. Stupidity is a more dangerous enemy of the good than malice, he says. We can protest against evil, we can expose it, prevent it, and evil carries within itself the germs of its own subversion. It leaves us uneasy. But we can't do much against stupidity. Protest, force, doesn't do anything. Reason falls on deaf ears. Facts that contradict one's prejudgment simply don't need to be believed. In such moments, Bonhoeffer writes, the stupid person even becomes critical, and where facts are irrefutable, they are just pushed aside as inconsequential or incidental. And here the stupid person actually is so self-satisfied and can be irritated, actually becomes dangerous in this context, Bonhoeffer feels. And so we need to be quite cautious, he writes. We don't try to persuade them. If we want to understand them, if we want to get the better of stupidity, he says, we must seek to understand its nature. It is a human problem, not an intellectual one. And he says we can be made stupid when under certain circumstances, and particularly in certain group contexts. And under closer observation, this is the key point, I think. He writes that it becomes apparent that every strong upsurge of power in the public sphere, be it of a political or religious nature, infects a large part of humankind with stupidity. Under this overwhelming impact of the rising power, humans step away from their inner independence and they give up their autonomous position. They quit thinking for themselves, you might say. And they're not independent. He says in conversation, one virtually feels that one is dealing not at all with him as a person, but with slogans, catchwords, and the like that have taken possession of him. He is under a spell, blinded, misused, and abused in his very being. And finally, having thus become a mindless tool, the stupid person it becomes capable of any evil and of not recognizing it as evil. In 1933, a wave of religious nationalism unleashed by the Nazi seizure of power carried Nazi ideology into the churches as part of the relentless politicization of all things by Hitler and his movement. And this religious nationalism was a primary, powerful force affecting Christians and churches throughout the Third Reich. The impact was powerful upon clergy. One of the district superintendents I studied proclaimed in 1933, "The face of the new Germany shall be that of a Christian nation." The following year, on another occasion, he proclaimed, "We are living witnesses of this powerful transformation, which we regard as the gracious act of God." So many pastors embraced this new religious nationalism, founded on a reciprocal notion that Protestantism was revealed most fully in the German nation, and that the German nationalism was incomplete without the presence of Protestantism in particular. So I'm going to blitz through a few quotes here. This is an example of the kind of language that these people use. "We know Hitler as one given to us by God. We bear his work in our prayers. We give him our respect, our obedience, our allegiance. We place ourselves without reserve behind the Reich government and are determined to support it with all our forces in its moral and national renewal." There's a spiritual change at work with the rise of the Nazis, another pastor claims, that is calling the church into a new service to the nation. There's no other possibility. We have to march along in the unity front of the nation, one Reich, one Führer. And we have, as the church, we have to recognize the total claim of God in the total claim of the state. And just as the church remembers its foundation in the sacrificial death of Jesus, so the Third Reich remembers its foundation in the sacrificial death of the fallen who fought to bring Nazism to power. Every Protestant pastor should be deeply grateful that no atheists, but Christians are in charge of the German nation. In fact, Hitler fought 14 years for Christianity in the church. He was misunderstood. And next to God, the church and Christendom has the National Socialist leader, Adolf Hitler, to thank for its existence. And Hitler has saved us from a red dictatorship. God has given us a Führer to lead us back from the abyss and to put us on solid ground again. In these quotations, and I could give you many, many more, there are three key ideas. One is that national renewal means moral renewal, a revival of Christianity. The second is that Hitler was calling clergy to participate in this renewal. And the third is that the greatest danger was on the radical left, and those Nazis were pretty good at crushing the communists. So maybe they're worthy of support. In fact, this ends up looking as if National Socialism, is a catalyst for German Protestant renewal. In 1933, particularly in the Protestant parts of Germany, in many parishes and church districts, church attendance, church memberships, baptisms, church weddings, the public participation of clergy in events all spike. And very directly from the side of the party, on particular festive occasions, the SA and the Stahlhelm veterans and the SA Reserve and the SS and the National Socialist Motor Corps and the Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls, come to church and attend church in uniform and in formation in support of Protestantism. We know that over time the situation changed, but in the early days, it tells us something, I think, about how Christians are attracted to the power of the Nazi movement, how religion and authoritarianism can gravitate toward one another and boost one another's fortunes and lend legitimacy to one another. Indeed, what this does is it actually carries clergy over into racial and exclusionary politics, the support for that. There is, for instance, a flood of literature during the Nazi era on the relationship between the folk, the racial community, the nation, and the church. There are monthly pastoral conferences where pastors give lectures to each other about our Volkskirche, our national or racial church, the church's service to the folk, Volkstum, racial identity, Staat, state, and Führertum, leadership. There are pastors who proclaim national uniformity of the blood, national character is God-willed. And others who talk about the importance of race research for religion and Christianity. And more extreme among them will go so far as to reject the Jewishness of Christianity. Doris Bergen, Susanna Heschel have written lots about this. One of my pastors I studied back in the day wrote, as German Christians, we have discerned the founder of Christianity had really nothing to do with the Jewish people. He was their greatest opponent. And Jesus is too holy, he says, to bring into connection with the Jews. So these are some of the ways I think we can see a reciprocal relationship between religion and authoritarianism. Just scratching the surface here, but churches are drawn by the power of authoritarian regimes, in turn legitimate authoritarian regimes, add the weight of theology and spiritual authority to exclusionary racial ideology, and bring these two things together. So the second idea I want to turn to then is the fraught relationship between opposition and complicity in exclusion and violence of authoritarian regimes. Now, again, there's all kinds of literature on this. Kate referred to some of it. Doris Bergen, just one example, describing religion as a break against mass brutality. Religion as healing or concealing factor in post-genocidal situations. And there are no shortage of initiatives. I've done a deep dive lately into all manner of United Nations work on religion and programs to combat extremism and so on. And you'll find in the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights Office, there's the Rabat Plan of Action going back to 2012 to work on the prohibition of the advocacy of national racial religious hatred, and a toolkit that goes along with that for Faith for Rights program. In the UN Office on Genocide Prevention and Responsibility to Protect, there's the Fez Declaration and Plan of Action from 2015 relating to religion and genocide. The UN Alliance of Civilizations has a 2019 plan to safeguard religious sites and programs like Eden, empowering dialogue and interfaith networks. But in this, we can see kind of a fraught relationship, I think, because we have religious leaders and communities working against incitement to violence and religious hate speech, and also at times working for the same. So how can we put that together? And again, I want to take you back into Bonhoeffer's After 10 Years and some of the sections in there. Who stands firm? This is early on in the essay. The essay is sort of 17 reflections strung together. This is one of the early ones. And Bonhoeffer writes, a huge masquerade of evil has thrown all ethical concepts into confusion. That evil should appear in the form of light, good deeds, historical necessity, social justice is bewildering to us. For a Christian who lives by the Bible, it's the confirmation of the abysmal wickedness of evil. And he asks the question, who stands firm? He goes through it, he describes, it's a bit long to read, so I won't read it, but he describes a failure of people who try to respond to evil through reasonableness, through conscience, through duty, through freedom, through virtue. And he says all of these fail. The only one who stands firm, he writes, is not the one standing by principles, conscience, freedom, virtue. The only one who stands firm, Bonhoeffer writes, is the one who's prepared to sacrifice all of these things. That sounds counterintuitive to us. But he says we need to sacrifice them, and actually responding to evil for Bonhoeffer is all about responding in faith and out of his relationship with God. It is extremely radical. Because what he's talking about is simply a believer following what they believe to be God's call. And this he describes as responsibility. Bonhoeffer writes a lot about the concept of responsibility. The person who will step into the ambiguous situation, step into the morally compromised situation. He picks this up in another section on success, where he says, you know, we're used to things go well when the good is successful. And we don't have to think about the ethics of success when the good is successful. But what happens when success comes through evil? And then he writes about responsibility again. He says, we can talk about going down heroically, fighting against evil, but this actually is not a facing of the future. The responsible answer, he says, is not about how I extricate myself heroically from a situation, but how can I act in a way that the coming generation can go on living? This, again, is responsibility for him. And then finally, towards the end of his essay, Bonhoeffer asks some very probing questions, I think. He asks the question, are we still of any use? He and his close friends have lived through 10 years of Nazi Germany. They're trying to make sense of all that's going on, trying to process it all. And he writes, we have been silent witnesses of evil deeds. We have become cunning and learned the arts of obfuscation and equivocal speech. Experience has rendered us suspicious of human beings, and often we have failed to speak to them a true and open word. Unbearable conflicts have worn us down and made us cynical. Are we still of any use? And his answer is that in a time like this, we will not need geniuses or cynics or people who have contempt for others or cunning tacticians. But the people that we need, he argues, are simple, uncomplicated, and honest human beings. Will our inner strength to resist what has been forced on us have remained strong enough, and our honesty within ourselves blunt enough to find our way back to simplicity and honesty? I've been chewing on this for about 5 years, and I still can't get through it. It's to my mind, a very profound reflection. And it is, I think, a recognition, and we know this from other things about Bonhoeffer, his involvement in the resistance, for instance. It is this recognition that religious opposition against authoritarian politics and exclusionary violence has to reckon with the complicity of religion in authoritarian politics and exclusionary violence. Only then can we find our way to genuine responsibility in the face of these kinds of moral and political crises. Thank you.
All right. Thank you both so much. The rest of the time, we've got about 20 minutes or so, is for comments and conversation. I see, Tim, there's a hand in the back corner here.
I love it. You're two great questions. Okay, we'll just go in this early.
Perfect. First of all, thank you so much to both of you for your talk. It was very informative and I enjoyed it very much. This question is primarily for Kate, but both of you are free to answer. And please also, if you feel like this is not a question you'd be comfortable answering, you may skip it. In light of very recent events, why do you think it is that even though the American right is so religious in terms of Christianity, chooses to overlook the blatant blasphemy on the part of certain politicians? Why could you give us maybe your assessment of events, things like anything like that?
Yeah.
That is recent news, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. Sure. I think a lot of that has to do with a shared kind of conservatism between an authoritarian regime and between some of these religious communities. And then going back to a point that I made earlier, which is because of this commitment and because of this sense of obedience and loyalty, you're willing to overlook certain things as long as you feel as though fundamentally they're speaking a language that you can endorse, or that there's certain kinds of benefits that you get from supporting that person. So everybody knows that Donald Trump is not is not somebody who would consider himself a devout Christian, but yet he shrouds himself with those symbols and he speaks that kind of language because he needs to continue to court the base that will support his particular kind of agenda. And it's things like the rolling back of abortion rights. It's things like persecution of the trans community, right? So those kind of through lines, this is something that GAW talks about as a through line for a lot of authoritarian regimes, is this kind of demonization and persecution of LGBTQI people, and particularly trans people now, because people have become more familiar with people who are gay, right? You have friends who are gay, you have family members that are gay, right? Marriage equality. But those who have a trans identity, that's something that's hard to fit into a box for people, right? That's an unknown that's particularly scary for people. And so as long as there are communities that are reacting against that, and you have a regime who's willing to attack those people, right, then you're speaking my language, and it doesn't really matter whether or not you quote unquote embrace, my tradition. The last quick thing I'll say, and this is actually something that Doris brings up, is that she says it's often dangerous to get into like who's really a Christian, who really isn't, right? You have an historical tradition. And then you have an idealized kind of ideology that the people who say they're a part of that tradition move forward, and that it gets dangerous if you try to talk about who isn't authentically Christian. And so I think that's why you very carefully kind of phrased it as, but there are things that we're saying are blasphemous against what we typically hold as Christian ideals. And so I think it's important to kind of keep those two things separate, but I still think that you answer it in a way that kind of shows that nuance.
I think just to add a couple of thoughts to that, I think the PRRI research that Kate was referring to earlier, it's a very interesting study, and gives you a whole checklist of sort of value propositions that where Christian nationalists align. And I think sometimes we fall into the idea that say the Trump phenomenon is he's just taken the Christians and sort of confuse them or something. But there's such a long tradition that it's the opposite way that leads to Trump. So I think you have to think about that. And the oh shoot, I was going to say, I know. There are some very interesting ideas. challenging ideas if you sort of wade into that world a little bit. And one of them that I think helps explain Trump too is the King Cyrus ideal, that where you've got a pagan leader, but who serves the purposes of God, and the Supreme Court and all these things. Like, so I think there are ways to explain it, but it's also the dissonance just is a bit crazy making out.
Yeah, that's a divine instrument that I talked about before,
Yeah.
right? Like you don't have to actually be a Christian, but you're an instrument being used by God for our ends.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much for being here and giving us that talk. I think this is an especially important issue in today's society. I would just like to ask, how do we prevent ideas of religious authoritarianism in religious communities without maybe offending or criticizing the religion itself, or is that even possible?
I have a very kind of nuts and bolts answer to that one. I think, but it's actually more an observation. I would say one of the things I've observed in the Christian and church circles in which I run are that we're seeing a new kind of fundamentalism emerge. And maybe in the past, you say, well, okay, this kind of Christian, that kind of Christian, that kind of Christian, but we're all part. And now it's as if it's like, here is the box, and if you're not in it, you don't count. So it's just more an observation than an answer. But I think there's has to be a pushing back against the very narrow definitions of what is Christian that arise among more fundamentalist circles, and to say, no, actually, there's definitions of Christian that are much more expansive, even going back to Apostles' Creed or early Christian creeds and that kind of thing, just to try to push out the boundaries of what is Christian. That would be my take on it.
Yeah, I have my two very brief observations. One is that you always want to model the kind of behavior that you want to see in other people. And so even if they're not members of your own group, if there are other religious groups who are engaging in nonviolent protests, for instance, right, that could be another model that those people who are in those smaller groups are at least seeing. The second one, this actually goes back to the report that Kyle mentioned, was I wrote a piece a couple of years ago looking at this plan of action that was proposed for involving religious actors in mass atrocity prevention and even maybe forecasting. And one of the criticisms I had of that report is that they emphasize a lot of kind of inter-religious dialogue, like, oh, the Muslims need to talk to the Christians, the whatever. How about intra-religious dialogue? How about people actually trying to head off the radicalization of people within their own ranks, right?
Yeah.
To me, that seems a lot more important.
Yeah.
And so if you can get one or two people within those communities that have some kind of exposure that then could come back to the communities and say, speaking from, people listen to people who look like them, who listen from in their groups, right? I think those are two things that could help with some of that. You're welcome.
Hi there.
I think there were some hands. Oh, okay. Yeah, go ahead, Evan. Okay.
Wow. Oh, yeah.
Hi there. Thank you both. Really appreciate the panel. This question is primarily for Dr. Jantzen, but be happy to hear from the both of you. I'm thinking about the kind of language that we use to frame the relationship between authoritarianism and religious communities. And I'm thinking I'd be interested in hearing your perspective as a historian focused on Nazi Germany and making these very direct comparisons to the present moment in the United States. You used the language in your slide of the reciprocal relationship between religion and authoritarianism. And then in the remainder of your talk, you use the phrase drawn into on a number of occasions to describe what happens to religions. So I'm thinking this image of religion being some sort of a social object that is acted upon by external forces. And I wonder if maybe the Nazi case tells us something about that. Because certainly in the American case, the project of authoritarianism that we now see realizing itself on a much grander scale has its roots very explicitly in religious communities dating back, I'd say, to the days immediately following the Civil Rights Act
Correct.
of 1965.
Yeah.
This is a project
Yeah.
realized primarily in fellowship halls
Yeah.
in the United States. So like,
Yeah.
if we were talking about the American case,
Correct.
I would put it the other way around. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that. Thanks.
So I will give you a kind of a personal response in a way. I found myself over the last decade, almost now, having repeated, and I'm willing to speak for all my colleagues in the field, but I've tested this with some of them and I've gotten a lot of nodding heads. I've had a lot of moments where all of a sudden I think, oh, that makes sense now. And because of what I'm living through, what we're living through, these things that we don't expect to happen but keep happening, be quite vague about it, I'm having these new realizations, these sort of epiphanies about my research, even though I'm not working on it. But it's because of my own, and it's this sort of past-present relationship that is what history is, right? And out of that, I found myself working on a new metaphor, and it's not a great metaphor, but it's kind of all I can think about, and that is the idea of bending Christianity toward far-right politics. And what I mean by that is it's as if the whole, it's like what I mentioned about like folk and Kirche and all that. Like there's this obsession with a discourse that is kind of imposed, or is just so much a part of the air that you can't escape it. And so it's state actors are bending, church actors are bending, regular people, even when they're trying to oppose, end up bending because everyone is so preoccupied with it. So there's a kind of I don't know, I'm not expressing it very well, but there's a kind of a kind of obsession about these questions that just takes over. And I think in the case of Nazi Germany, that is something that is produced. I mean, it comes from both sides, but I think it starts a bit more there with the rise of the Nazi movement. But the churches take it up very quickly, and they're actors too. I don't want to make it sound as if they're passive. They're very much caught up in it and active in it as well.
Great. Well, thank you for a stimulating talk. I'm sorry. Is there someone else speaking?
You go, I don't see.
Okay. I want to harken back to a talk that Kate and Kyle and I heard last night at the John Frank lecture. And one of the points that kind of slowly came through during that somewhat disengaging talk was that in American history, there have been times when we've treated people very inhumanely. And certainly slavery is an obvious example. Japanese internment, the treatment of wetbacks, the pre-civil rights movement. And I wonder if genocide scholars look at issues of religion within those not genocidal, but very much violent and suppressing movements in a nation's history. Because to me, there's kind of a continuity between putting people in a camp, even if you're not going to exterminate them, and the Holocaust. And I just wonder if, as scholars of religion, that's a terrain that you find interesting to try to connect up with your work.
Yes, actually, one of the ways in which I positioned myself when I became a genocide scholar was that if you think about it historically, even now, even though it seems like there's a genocide happening every other day, they're statistically rare. And so if I'm going to be the scholar who's going to talk about something that's statistically rare, I'm also interested in how can those phenomena help me with other kinds of areas and spheres of life. And so, yeah, so I think probably one of the greatest examples of that would be dehumanization and this kind of othering. And in a religious context, that othering can take on even greater levels of kind of transcendence and emergency, where it's not just about protecting yourself against a group, but protecting entire civilization against that group, or the fact that there's, again, some kind of cosmic struggle that's at play other than the political struggle that might be at play. So yeah, so I think that there are opportunities to think about how religion then can accentuate, heighten, legitimate the ways in which people are othered in a dehumanization process. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I just wonder if the scholarship is also picked up on your thought, or you're kind of out there on it.
Oh, gotcha. No, I don't think so. I mean, I think ideas like othering and dehumanization, those are not, atypical. I mean, those are pretty, I think, well-trodden kind of concepts. But I think where I might be a bit more of an outlier, if you will, is that, again, little self-promotion, is that I wrote a piece in a chapter on religion and genocide that specifically looks at the field of genocide studies and religion, and that looks at some of the attention by government and non-governmental organizations in religious actors, and actually involving them in things like genocide and atrocity prevention. And my next work is going to be looking at how that happened. Because I've talked to people at Department of State, they're like, they were allergic to religion in the 90s. They want nothing to do with it. They were looking at the Rwandan genocide. They're like, religion's horrible, right? Like this is a problem from hell. We do not want to deal with it. We went from that to like actively trying to recruit and train religious actors to help with forecasting genocide and preventing it. Like that's quite about face, right? So there's that. And then there's also the fact that in the literature, religion often attended conflicts, but it wasn't a focus because religious difference wasn't necessarily the instigating factor. It was seen as something that was helping foment, right? Or something that could be layered on top of something. And so I've been in the field, I've been trying to kind of center it more in ways that I think it hasn't been in recent years. And in that way, I kind of am one amongst a few. And trying to say like, no, religion's like, I'm serious. Like, it's really, really important. Yeah.
There's two questions from Henry Terrio, who's here, but he's in the overflow room. Yeah.
That's a good question.
So I'll read them both, but the first question is for Kyle, and then the second question is for both of you. The first question for Kyle is, would you say that the closing quote you discussed is very specific to the weariness of those who lived under Nazism oppositionally, or has more general implications even for those living in societies that are not in situations of genocide or other religious and other mass violence or persecution? ? And then to both of you, could you comment on cases in which two distinct religious groups have joined against a third, and comment on whether the dynamics are similar to what you have discussed or there are differences? One could argue that we are seeing this in a joining of some evangelical Christians and some religiously Jewish people vis-a-vis Palestinians, who are usually seen as exclusively Muslim, even though some are Christian. And I could also think of some historical examples myself. That's me speaking.
In terms of the first question, I think it's very right to draw attention to the weariness of Bonhoeffer, and this is a few months before he's arrested, and he's just trying to come to terms with things. I guess I do think it has wider resonance. I think it's quite relevant. I find it quite a helpful way to understand our own times. Actually, to be perfectly honest, I think it's very useful. Second question.
I think we've certainly seen, and this might be something that you were thinking about, amongst, like, say, fundamentalist Christian and Jewish traditions against an Islamic tradition. And we've seen, especially in going back to the idea of religion and authoritarianism, is that, just as I said, that sometimes, as Gayat said, you see this through line with like transphobia or with LGBTQ issues. You also see one when it comes to things like xenophobia. And so if you're trying to like shut down a religious organization or take away its 503c status or something like that, you try to say, well, they're involved with international actors. And so there's this kind of xenophobia, like this, allergic. And then the other one is, oh, and they're terrorists, which is code for Muslim. And so there is this kind of Islamophobia, I think, that allows several communities to come together in the name of terrorism and in the name of security to then position themselves as somehow being against this group. If that, I'm not sure if that quite answers the question. But you said you had other examples.
I can think of a bunch actually.
Yeah.
When I think about it, like I was thinking off the top of my head, the 17th century in Orthodox Christians, Orthodox Christian alliance, Ukrainian Orthodox Christian alliance with the Muslim Tatars against Jews who are being maneuvered by Catholics. So that's what I was just, one example.
That's four, yeah.
I think in the case of evangelical or fundamentalist Christians and Jews vis-a-vis Israel, there are particular theological reasons for that go back to the 19th century and the whole dispensationalist movement, and so I think there's very particular reasons for that one. At any rate,
So what
I
we're
want
gonna-
to. Do you want to?
Yeah, I was going to say, I want to do a quick rapid fire because we have 2 student questions here and some favoritism. One of my favorite students has a question online that I think is a great question too. So I was hoping we could just do like a quick student rapid fire. Could you two?
I also have 45 questions that I've written down.
I also have questions about racializing religion. There are a lot of questions. Continue.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, well, that's good because my question is very similar to the last one. Why do you think that it's like some of the most like ardent supremacist Christians that seem to be some of the biggest supporters of the idea of like a Jewish supremacist state of Israel?
well, that goes back to dispensational theology and this notion of eras and the idea that the Christian story culminates in the return of the Jews to Israel, their conversion to Christianity, and all things coming together at the end time. So they care for very different reasons than Jews do, but there's a real synergy of interest there. I know it's bizarre to be in those conversations. Yeah.
Do you guys have any insight? Obviously, we've been talking about the tie between religion and authoritarian regimes, but specifically the tie between religion and perhaps the survival of a genocide. Obviously, when you have 2 religious forces opposing one another, I think one over relies on religion to justify their violence, but the other over relies on religion just as a form of perhaps divine protection and survival. I was wondering if you guys have any insights on that.
You said Doris.
I said Doris Bergen before.
Okay. Yeah.
Oh, right. Yeah. So she said like a break against violence, right? Or as a coping mechanism. You also have rescue behavior, religious communities. Although what's interesting though is that religiosity doesn't necessarily make you any more likely to rescue than someone who isn't religious, but actually, why am I blanking? Browning? Not Browning. Why am I blanking? In the lowlands. It is a Browning? Okay. Who indicated it's actually not whether you're religious, it's whether or not that community is a religious minority. Within that's going to make it more likely for them to rescue.
The Dutch study, yeah.
Yeah. So and so those are some of the ways in which religion can actually help.
Yeah, I can. This is the one from Christina. Yeah. Okay. So Christina Hubbard, she asked, do you have any predictions of how the Christian nationalism movement will derail in the future? ? Will it simply weaken over time or fall apart on its own? Or would it take action on the part of society to resist it and end its progression?
Sorry.
Yeah. I guess the short answer to that might be 2 words, which is Peter Majer, which is we just saw it happen in Hungary. So I think there's a possibility that there could be a rallying of people that come together that then try to put a stop to the development of these communities, or of their influence at least.
I think the intertension between the core values of a kind of a small O Orthodox Christianity and the kind of Christian nationalist movement, I think that intertension cannot live forever. I think ultimately it's just a fundamental discrediting of Christian faith. But when? Yeah. That's who knows.
Yeah, you know, they say history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, right? So I think, so if we're seeing a rise of populism, a rise of autocracy, then we might, just as we've just seen a 16-year authoritarian regime come to an end, maybe this will also start to be what's going to then happen in other countries that follow suit.
Do you have 45 questions rapid fire?
Yeah. Oh, man. Get ready.
Okay.
I've got a few questions around Christian nationalism. I've got other questions, but since that's the topic here, one is, is religious nationalism always bad? That seems to be how it's talked about. Are there examples to the contrary?
I think this is a good example of when Scott Appleby talks about the ambivalence of the sacred, right? The idea that's really not anything inherent to religion in and of itself about the people who practice it. And so the idea of, and we've seen this plenty of times, like of an ethno-religious identity, this sense of that part of my community and then part of my religious practice, right, that they're somehow interconnected with each other, I don't think necessarily is a bad thing. But what's interesting, and this is somebody that I've also been reading lately, have been people like Hubert Leger and like Grace Davy, which is, you also have this interesting phenomenon now that we've pretty much discredited the secularization thesis, right? This idea that religion would just become privatized, it wouldn't have any role in public life, is that you have, for instance, in the case of Grace Davy, who talks about concept of believing without belonging, right? So this sense of that I don't actually, I believe in the tradition, but I don't go to church anymore, right? So she talks about, say, Britain as an example. But then if you have somebody like Hubert Leger, I might actually say the opposite and say it's kind of like belonging without believing, which is that I see as part of my national identity that we're French and that we're also Catholic, right? Or that we're what? And so that's part of who we are. I take pride in that history, even if I'm not a practicing person of that tradition. So I don't think it necessarily has to be negative. I think it becomes negative, it becomes exclusionary, or it becomes negative, in my case, like we say somewhere in France, when the idea of your ability to be able to assimilate to a community is based on sharing that heritage, that becomes problematic, because then you could never actually become part of our community because you don't share that heritage. Like that's, I think, when it becomes problematic. Does that answer your question?
It does. Or do we probably need to wrap up now?
Yeah, because we have something at 4 and all.
I'll save the other 44 for later.
Sorry.
And I've got,
My fault. It's a long answer.
you know,
I apologize.
Something important, I think, you know, drawing off of your work to remember too, when we talk about religion with
Yep.
this, like to right size it.
Yeah.
The religion's part of it, but when you hear things like if there was no religions, there'd be no conflict. That's absolutely not true. I can't think of a genocide that was religiously driven. It can be a deadly accelerant,
Right.
but being the primary or the sole role, like, yeah. So, you know, so it's also important to right size religion in these conversations, because I think sometimes it can get overstated. I know there's other questions. However, we have a Yom HaShoah commemoration at 4 p.m. and it's over at Mirabella. So it's going to be a very short walk, but we want to be there at 4. And Professor Steve Remy will be speaking there as well. And we pick up, and that's not going to be live streamed. So we'll pick up for the online audience again tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. When Tartil Al-Imam will be our Sudanese survivor opening up tomorrow. And I'm going to turn to Stan. Did you want to say anything about the Yom HaShoah commemoration?
Yeah, it's we're going to hear from one of our piano faculty at ASU. They'll be performing several different pieces of music from various Holocaust composers, including some who wrote music in Terezin. So it should be a very moving tribute and to Yom HaShoah. And for those of you who don't know, Mirabella is our retirement community here on ASU, a pilot program, one of the first in the country to have a retirement community here on campus. And I think that that's a very beautiful connection between the generations. And so it's a nice venue for us to attend. So everyone's welcome to attend and join the residents at Mirabella to hear this commemoration. Say?
That's why we're here.
That's why we're here. Well, now you know who to
Okay.
follow. Yeah.
And if
Follow
anybody,
him.
yes, if people have questions about how to get to Mirabella, just ask us,
Yeah,
follow us.
it's
and-
super close. It's less than 0.2 miles.
And last thing, again, NAU, thank you for showing up and making today what it was. Foster, Carl, I think Saba actually sent some students as well, Alex. And so Team NAU, we see you, we appreciate you, and you bring an energy every year and we love it. So thank you. And safe travels home.